So if you didn't notice, the word vanity came up in that whole entire chapter a total of about 9 times. And that's only 9 out of the other 30, out of the 32 times he actually uses it in the whole book of Ecclesiastes. And that's because the Hebrew word hevel here in Ecclesiastes, this Hebrew word translated vanity in many of our English Bibles, represents the foremost major theme in Solomon's discourse here. He begins and he ends his speech in Ecclesiastes saying, "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher, "vanity of vanities, all is vanity." And I covered some of the nuances of this word in our introduction when we first started this book, but I think it's best for us to dive just a little bit deeper into this, as it does serve as bullet points for us through this portion of the text that we are walking through this morning. Now, as I mentioned before, this word translated vanity basically means breath or vapor, smoke. It refers to something that's futile or fleeting, which is some translations maybe prefer to render it meaningless. I'm not sure if you might have that in your translation, which is problematic for many reasons. For one, it does allow people to interpret the book itself from a purely pessimistic or nihilistic point of view, especially by this being the major theme of the book of Ecclesiastes. But suffice it to say that Solomon is not regarding all things as meaningless at all, but he's rather making a statement about the transitory, temporary nature of life in this world. And while the word vanity can be referred to as vapor or smoke, it's best to see him using this term to describe something as fleeting, just simply fleeting. Something that, like smoke or like breath on a cold winter day, can appear to have a form or a substance or an appearance of substance, but it passes through your fingers and it disappears as soon as you try to grasp a hold of it. Essentially, to attempt to take hold onto something as fleeting as smoke is a futile attempt in and of itself. And so if we consider again Solomon's comprehensive statement in chapter 1, verse 2, that vanity, that all things are vanity, that it's fleeting, that it's transient. And then through the rest of the book, he explains in detail what those all things he refers to is vanity. Solomon comes to this conclusion because of the lack of lasting value or satisfaction he saw that one can receive in this world. That there's no real advantage or profit at the end of man's labor and trouble in this life. Right there in verse 3. He says, in chapter 1, verse 3, he says, "What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun?" And then after that, there's these monotonous, perpetual cycles that have been established in God's created order that fail to produce any progress. We see them starting in verse 4. He talks about the solar system, the wind, the seas, and even the human faculties of sight and sound. They just never seem to become satisfied or culminate or to become complete in any way. They just keep going and going and going tirelessly. And then he contrasts that with the temporary life of man that just ends without any lasting impact at all. And here he is, Solomon, a man according to 1 Kings chapter 4, was the one that God gave wisdom and a very great discernment and breadth of understanding in his heart, like the sand that is in the seashore. In verse 30, it says that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east and the wisdom of the Egypt. And then in chapter 10, verse 23 of 1 Kings, it says, Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. Unmatched in wisdom and wealth, both of those things, he's left with the fact that there are some things that neither wisdom or wealth can resolve. That wisdom and knowledge can also be a source of misery and pain as they uncover painful realities about life that man has no control over. So in an effort to find his own satisfaction in this life, to live life to the fullest, so to speak, and to escape from the curse, if you will, in chapter 2, Solomon begins to experiment with hedonism, a diligent search to draw out all the pleasure and enjoyment he can out of this life through worldly and godless means. And so he toys with the idea of indulging in alcohol in verse 3. Then he throws himself into various building and agricultural projects, attempting to create his own place of perfection, a personal garden of Eden in verses 4 through 6. And he amasses possessions of property and people to serve him in his work, to be sources of entertainment for him, and to be objects of his sexual pleasure in verse 8. And so in verses 9 through 11, Solomon stands at the end of this hedonistic expedition, and he evaluates this end result. Because after he wasted much of his time, his talents, and his treasure on the temporary and fleeting things of this world, he looks back at utter disgust, unsatisfied with the return on investment. And here in verses 12 through 26, Solomon continues this evaluation of the life he's lived and the lost investment of the life that he's given to the task of finding enjoyment and satisfaction apart from God. He considers all that he's experienced and all that he's witnessed, and he labels certain aspects of them to be futile. With this recurring refrain, this too is vanity. But at the same time, he also in this points out the real value that we should find in life. So Solomon, the preacher, the Koheleth, offers 5 evaluations about life in this cursed world that he considers to be vanity, futile, a waste of time. Number 1, the wisdom of men is vanity in verses 12 through 17. Wearisome labor is vanity in verses 18 through 19. Worth of legacy is vanity in verses 20 through 21. Worry over work is vanity in verses 22 to 25. And finally, the wealth of the sinner is vanity in verse 26. As we begin through our exposition, we start with the wisdom of men is vanity. Look at verse 12. He says, "So I turn to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done?" Solomon has done it all. He surpassed every king before him in wisdom and wealth, and he will forever have his jersey hung in the rafters of the kings of Israel. And he'll go on record as the man with the most accomplishments to his name, leaving his mark on this world that he was indeed here. And he knows it. He said in verse 10 that of chapter 2, that he left no stone unturned in his search for pleasure. He never said no to himself. He has never left any project undone. And as a result, he left nothing on the table for any king who would come after him. No one could top what he's done. No one could have more than what he's had. History's been made already. But the man who will come after him in this regard is not just referring to Solomon's would-be successors, because this applies to anyone. No man, no king or billionaire could have what Solomon had and take on such an investigation as he took and come out with a different result on the other end. But that doesn't stop people from trying, though, does it? Many individuals today are also trying to escape the curse and find lasting satisfaction in this world apart from God. And then Solomon makes this observation in verse 13. He says, "And I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness." Now, this verse is a bit challenging translated this way, but I really like the way the Legacy Standard Bible translates it. It says, And I saw that there is an advantage in wisdom over simple-minded folly, as light has an advantage over darkness. It's a little bit clearer, isn't it? Again, Solomon has done it all. He's exercised great wisdom as well as experimented with great foolishness. And he knows the difference between the two and the result of both according to his own empirical research. If you remember in our introduction to Ecclesiastes a while back, the word advantage was also one of the recurring themes that we would frequently run into in our study. Advantage is this concept of profit. A shrewd investor is someone who is interested in getting back more than they put into it. And this Hebrew noun, yithron, is the word translated advantage here in this verse. Now, Solomon admits that though wisdom has its limits back in chapter 1, but here he admits that it also has its advantages. That hasn't gone away at all. If you remember, this is the same Solomon who said in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 5, acquire wisdom, acquire understanding. Then he says in verse 6, do not forsake her and she will guard you. Love her and she will watch over you. Chapter 16, verse 16, he says, how much better is it to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding is to be chosen above silver. So it was advantageous to have wisdom. And it's more advantageous even over foolishness. And this must be said because there's somewhat of an allure in our culture to foolishness. There certainly was, especially to Solomon to some degree. But our world is attracted to people who speak foolishly, who live recklessly, and who squander their God-given, God-allotted time away. And it would appear that such people are, in fact, living life and having fun. Yet there is no advantage whatsoever to living that kind of conduct. There's nothing of value to having that kind of a lifestyle. The man who lives with applied knowledge and acts shrewdly in this life fares better than a simple-minded fool. In the same way that light overcomes darkness, wisdom overcomes foolishness. And next in verse 14, he says, the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. I love this poetic Hebrew language here. Now, what does it mean that the wise man's eyes are in his head? If you look at it in comparison with the fool walking in darkness, it probably brings a little bit more clarity to the meaning, I'm sure. And this is to say that the wise man is cautious. He's calculated. He's exercising discernment in how he lives, how he moves. His eyes are attached to the brain in his head. Furthermore, this idea of eyes being in the head gives us a sense of stability being pictured here, a sense of resolve. You could take this verse and contrast that with Proverbs chapter 17, verse 24. It says, wisdom is in the presence of one who has understanding, but the eyes of a fool are on the ends of the earth. The fool's eyes are all over the place. In other words, they're not fixed on eternal realities, but wandering onto a variety of worldly allurements. And he says the fool walks in darkness, furthermore. What happens when you walk in darkness? Obviously, you can't see, clearly at least. There's no direction. There's no guidance. You can't discern danger from opportunity. You can't tell whether the door is closed or whether it's open. Walking in darkness is dangerous to life and limb and to soul and spirit. To walk in darkness is also a commonly used metaphor for someone who is living in sin or is an unbeliever. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 19, the way of the wicked is like darkness. They do not know over what they stumble. John 11, verse 10 says, but if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. In John 12, verse 35 says, so Jesus said to them, for a little while longer, the light is among you. walk while you have the light, so that darkness will not overtake you. He who walks in darkness does not know where he goes. In 1 John chapter 2, verse 11 says, but the one who hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in darkness, and does not know where he is going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes. Notice there's lots of other verses that talk about walking in darkness, but I selected these here so we can notice the correlation between someone who's walking in darkness and them stumbling and not knowing where they're going. So again, wisdom has an advantage over foolishness. It's better to live life with wisdom than to be foolish. However, Solomon also says here, and yet I know that one fate befalls them both. This could be translated also as, even though I know that one event falls them both. Because fate may have a different connotation in your mind as some sort of impersonal force or a random stroke of chance. But Solomon doesn't have room for that in his theology at all. He's fully aware of God's control over all things, and has already stated that these harsh realities about life have been imposed upon man by God himself in chapter 1, verse 13. So the word fate here is simply referring to an event that happens to every man. It's often called the great equalizer. Of course, I'm talking about what? Death. Even the wisest man couldn't escape from death. Now, wait a minute, isn't this the same Solomon who said in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 13, how blessed is a man who finds wisdom and a man who gains understanding? In verse 16, long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. If you remember chapter 9 of Proverbs, where Solomon actually personifies wisdom, and wisdom says in chapter 9, verse 11 of Proverbs, for by me your days will be multiplied, and years of life will be added on to you. Even later on in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 12, Solomon says, for wisdom is protection just as money is protection. But the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of its possessors. Shouldn't I have a long life if I'm wise? While it's true that wisdom can preserve your life in the sense that it can help you avoid many pitfalls that can lead to an untimely death due to foolishness, foolish behavior. However, that doesn't change the fact that our days are numbered, according to Job chapter 14, verse 5. That Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27 says it's appointed a man to die once, and after that comes the judgment. That doesn't change anything. And though the wise man is better than the fool, it doesn't change the fact that both the wise man and the fool will both die at some point. Furthermore, Solomon says in verse 15, he says, then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Then he says, why then have I become extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity. Solomon now brings this fact down to his level and applies it to himself. Here he is again, endowed with the most wisdom of any man, and he comes to the realization that even being the wisest man in the world won't protect him from death. That one day he and all his great wisdom will be no more. No matter how well he plays the game of life, he will meet the same fate as the one who has lived his life as a loser. If you've been to a graveyard, you'll find gravestones with the names of individuals below the ground who represent the same type of individuals that are above the ground. Everyone who has lived long lives and those who live relatively short lives. There are those who were at one time considered famous, and there are those who were considered insignificant. Men who were thieves, their grave is sitting right next to those who were philanthropists. Women who were regarded as beautiful next to those who were deemed unattractive. The rich lies next to the poor. The health conscious in the same space as drug addicts in the grave. Those who live their lives wisely as well as those who live their lives foolishly. You name it. Everyone else is there. Death is a great equalizer. So Solomon asks a very valid question here. Why was he given such wisdom if in the end he'll die just like a fool? And though this question is not addressed to God here, it's a question only God has the answers to because he's the one who gave him that great wisdom. So Solomon looks at even at his wisdom and considers it to be vanity, a vapor. Because though he had an immeasurable resource of wisdom, it was limited by his short temporary life. And not only does the wise man and the fool share the same fate, their memory will also pass away just like them. If you look down at verse 16, he says, "For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die." If you remember back in chapter 1, verse 11, Solomon came to this conclusion regarding the things of the world, that there's no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the later things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. And the same thing applies to the lives of men, wise or fools. Their memory will also be wiped away by time. No lasting impact can really be made by acting in wisdom. Solomon even says back in Proverbs chapter 9, verse 12, "If you are wise, you're wise for yourself. And if you scoff, you alone will bear it." And then he adds this exclamation in the next expression, "And how the wise man and the fool alike die." Again, this is one event, the great equalizer, death. I remember a while ago, my wife and I were at a church event, and we were all there, and we heard a news story about a man who died in a sinkhole that opened up underneath his house right in his bedroom. It's a freak accident, right? And upon hearing this story, a lady in the group responded, "They definitely weren't saved." And when I asked how she knows that, she said, "God wouldn't take a saved person out like that." Now, I wish that were the case, that the saved die in dignity and they simply pass away peacefully. But that's not always the case, is it? In reality, in most cases at least, there's no difference in the way a wise man dies and the way a fool dies. Commentator Herbert Leupold says, "It may come to both suddenly. It may arrive when important things seem to clamor for completion. It may be by accident. It may be accompanied by much pain or protracted sickness. As to the outward form and the attendant circumstances, no man can draw any exact conclusion as to whether he that dies governed himself by wisdom or not." End quote. Again, the great equalizer. Both the wise man and the foolish man, regardless of the adjective, they're still men. And as the saying goes, the best of men are what? Men at best. Next he says in verse 17, "So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind." Very strong words there. Hated life. You can sense the frustration here in these two verses. In the next verse that I'm going to read, but there's some parallel features that have these verses, verse 17 and verse 18 together. There's an object of the hatred, and then there's a reason for the hatred. In verse 17, life was the object of his hatred. He hated life because it was spent on working for temporary pleasures. The allurement of enjoyment and satisfaction, they wore off already. And now all he could see was the blood, sweat, and the tears and the time that he spent acquiring it. This was a bad investment for him. He put way more in it than he got out of it. He got zero profit. Now, some may be taken aback by Solomon's statements here that he hated life. It's a little jarring. Some commentators either label Solomon a pessimist, while others try to explain away his words. But that's what he said. A person who hates life is commonly associated with someone who's struggling with some sort of clinical depression. But I don't get the sense that Solomon is just referring to hating his life in particular. He doesn't hate the fact that he exists. He just hates the way that everything turned out. He spent his life and worked hard at hedonism, expecting to receive back real purpose and fulfillment in the pursuit of pleasure, and the result of it was unsatisfactory. But I think we might be able to identify with Solomon if we did what he did and invested what he invested and got back the same result. If we could just take a much smaller illustration here. You guys ever play that claw game? Like that claw machine game? It's probably in like Denny's or something like that. It's like it looks so easy, doesn't it? It looks like anybody can win it. Just looks so very simple. You just position it right over the toy, and you want to select the one that's just kind of out, right? You don't want to get one that's really deep in there. You want to select the toy that's readily available to get grabbed, right? And so you find it free on the top, nothing to hold it back. You shore yourself, and then you go ahead and press that red button, and it drops down, and the claw comes over it, and then it just kind of like lazily like clasps without the toy, right? So again, it looks easy, so you put more money into it, right? And exactly the same thing happens. And at the end of it, you spend like $50 on a $2 toy. And you most likely got nothing. And so you realize at this point, this game is not meant to be won. You'd hate that game, wouldn't you? Of course. And maybe you get a sense of how Solomon felt. And so I would say that this is an understandable response, especially the way that he lived his life. He gambled away the prime of his life on a game of world and pleasure, and he's discovered now that the game is rigged, that there's no way a man can win at this game. He will always lose, and the same thing happens to those who play the world's game. The game of this world has been rigged, so there's no chance of him winning. And this obviously infuriated him, that the wise man has become a fool. He got played. He played himself. Again, this is the same realization everyone comes to when they think that they can draw meaning and value out of this cursed world apart from God. No wonder so many celebrities and public figures, after a while, they become reclusive and erratic, pessimistic and angry about life. Now, all he can see from that experience is the pain that he went through. He said it was grievous to him. And at the end, he said that too was hevel, or futility, striving after wind. In verse 18, now his hatred moves toward the fruit of his labor, the end result. And our next point, wearisome labor is vanity. Verse 18 through 19. Verse 18, he says, thus I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. So there was fruit for the labor. He did get something out of it, only it was not of any real value associated to what he put into it. I mean, back to our analogy, this is like spending $50 to win a $2 toy. Even if you do get the toy, when you look at the price tag and see that $2 on there, you're not going to feel too good about that toy, are you? You're going to not treasure the toy. You're going to think back about the $50 that you lost. Though you received the award, when you look at what you got, all you can see is the money that you wasted on it. But there's an even bigger reason why he hated what he got. He says, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. Now notice back in chapter 2, verse 10, he says that his heart was pleased because of his labor, and this was his reward for all his labor. He did get that $2 toy. But now he hated the reward, the fruit of his labor. Notice when it was in his possession, it brought him a sense of pleasure and temporary feeling of achievement. However, when he dies, it no longer will be his, but it's going to be somebody else's. And he works so hard only to come up with something of nothing of value. Even worse, now that he has to now hand off what he's worked for, and now he has no control over that. If you remember what I read earlier in Psalm 39, verse 6, it says, surely every man walks about as a phantom. Surely they make an uproar for nothing. He amasses riches and does not know who will gather them. Again, the satisfaction and pleasure in what he worked for wore off because he has to leave it behind to go to the next man who will, of course, not have the same level of wisdom that he had. Look down at verse 19. He says, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool, yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. In the book of Proverbs, Solomon constantly addresses his sons throughout the book. Look with me for just a second. Turn to Proverbs, turn to the book of Proverbs, and just look at chapter 1, verse 8. He says, hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Look at chapter 2, verse 1. My son, if you will receive my words and treasure my commandments with you. Chapter 3, verse 1. My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart hear my commandments. Chapter 4, verse 10. Hear, my son, and accept my sayings, and the years of your life will be many. Chapter 5, verse 1. My son, give attention to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding. Turn all the way to chapter 19, verse 27. He says, cease listening, my son, to discipline, and you will stray from the words of knowledge. Now, somebody may argue that the son or sons he's referring to was just a metaphor. He's talking to everybody, the men of the kingdom, and that the audience was much bigger. But let's not forget, according to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 6 and 7, the men of Israel were charged with the obligation to pass down God's instruction to their sons as they go about daily life. So a man's disciples were to be, his primary disciples were to be his sons by mandate. So of course, his sons received instruction from Solomon. And if anyone were the primary beneficiaries of all that wisdom Solomon had, it was going to be them. And if that wisdom was to live on at all, it would be through his progeny. However, when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam became his successor. This young man became the direct heir of the throne, the recipient to everything that Solomon acquired except for his wives. And what happened? Well, if we had time, I would love to go through chapter 12 of 1 Kings, verse 1 through 15. But if you're familiar with the story, you might remember that even though young Rehoboam had the wisdom of his father, or heard the wisdom of his father Solomon, he did not follow in the wisdom of his father. Instead, we see no evidence, first of all, that he even consulted God for wisdom like his father did. Furthermore, he ignored the wisdom and the consultation of Solomon's advisors, and instead listened to the foolish, naive young men that he grew up with, and then he made a irreparable decision that ended up splitting the whole kingdom in two. And this concern actually became a self-fulfilling prophecy for Solomon. But before he died and it actually came to pass, just the possibility of that happening bothered him. And that brings us to our next point. Worth of legacy is vanity. Verse 20 through 21. Look at verse 20. He says, therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. Again, expressing this disdain over the work that he's invested his life into, because he's going to be forced to do a transfer on death for it all. But next, Solomon says the same thing applies to every man. Verse 21, when there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with them. This too is vanity and a great evil. Now, I'm a financial advisor by trade. And in the financial industry, we're experiencing what is an event referred to as the great wealth transfer. And this is the time when many of the baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964 are dying off, and they're leaving their assets that they worked so hard for over to their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. That's a great thing, but however, many times these beneficiaries receive these valuable inheritances in these properties, and instead of maintaining them and building them for their own legacy, they're maybe more inclined to actually quickly sell them off well under market value for just a quick buck. For some of them, it just allows them to spend it on pleasure items and worldly goods. And no matter how much they sell it for, it's all a profit to them because they didn't work for it. They just only inherited it. Which brings us to our next point. Worry over work is vanity. Verse 22 through 23. Look at the next verse. For what does a man get in all his labor, in all his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days, his task is painful and grievous. Even at night, his mind doesn't rest. This too is vanity. This concept of labor is in relationship to the curse given to man in Genesis chapter 3, passed down from Adam. The hardship and the difficulty that's required to eke out an existence in this life. He also calls it striving in this verse. And again, he's not just referring to himself here. He's speaking about mankind in general. As for him, he is a king who voluntarily put himself through labor and toil to create this empire. But the average man has to labor just in order to survive. That's the plight of his existence. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 19, by the sweat of your face you will eat bread. And for us, of course, our experience with labor is totally different than Solomon's, and also the average working man in Solomon's day. We can resonate with that. The nature of work in Israel was mostly made up of agricultural work. 23 times in the Old Testament, Israel is referred to as a land flowing with milk and honey. And this was confirmed in Numbers chapter 13, when Moses sent men from the tribes of Israel to spy out the land. And then Joshua and Caleb came back with some of the land's fruit. The land was fertile. It was a great place to grow crops and to feed livestock. And as you can imagine, this type of work required men to be outside in the hot sun, working hard. And then you had other men who were builders. You had some men who were carpenters, who were cutting down trees and working with wood. You had metalsmiths who harvested iron from the ground, and they worked with heat. Most of the vocations that men had in those days required them to work with their hands, to exert strength and energy day after day. But that's just the physical part of it. Labor tends to bring along with it a mental and emotional weight that continues even after the work is done for the day. Next, he says, that's why he says, even at night, his mind doesn't even get a chance to rest. Work never stays with you, right? It never stays where you left it, right? When you turn off your laptop at your desk, it doesn't just stay there. It's here, right? You take it home with you in your mind. You're considering what you have to do the next day, or the unfinished work that you have left over from the previous day that you have to deal with. And for some of us, it can kind of keep us up at night. I'm sure you can identify with that yourself. Many of us are consumed with work so much that it's hard to distance ourselves from it even when the weekend comes. It's understandable because most of us spend the majority of our waking lives working, a time away from our families. But how many of you actually go to bed with thoughts of work on your mind? Probably dream about it at night. I know I do. people you have to deal with, bosses you have to please, individuals that you have to give direction to, clients and customers that you have to work with. Unresolved situations and meetings and deadlines are constantly in our minds. I'm sorry, tomorrow's Monday. Maybe I should stop. But though you stop working with your hands, your mind does not rest. And again, this is the plight of man on earth, whether you're an employee or entrepreneur. That work requires physical and mental labor, something Solomon says is vanity. But yet, given the right perspective, the labor and work produce benefits that even Solomon can't ignore. Look at verse 24. He says, there is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen as from the hand of God. Now, we, in our introduction, looked at this recurring statement as well, as Solomon says repeatedly. He says, there is nothing better. And this is where Solomon draws this helpful conclusion from his experience and what to make of everything. This is where we get the answer to all of his rhetorical questions. This serves as helpful reminders for us because he crushes hope for us in the the temporal things in life, and then he provides us with the right mindset we're to have when it comes to life in this world. There is nothing better. And here he answers those rhetorical questions that he made previously in chapter 1, verse 3, where he says, what advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? And in chapter 2, verse 22, what does a man get in all his labor and striving in which he labors after the sun? He'll tell you. And notice that the first advantage he mentions here is eating and drinking. The primary benefit to men given the loving, providing hand of God. He mentions it in other passages here in Ecclesiastes as well. Just look with me for a second. In chapter 3, verse 13, it says, moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. Then he says it is the gift of God. Look at chapter 5, verse 18. Here is what I've seen to be good and fitting, to eat and to drink, and to enjoy oneself in all one's labor in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life which God has given him, for this is his reward. And then look at verse 19. Furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he's empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is a gift of God. One more. Chapter 18, verse 15 says, so I commended pleasure, for there is nothing good for a man under the sun except to eat and to drink and to be merry. And this will stand by him in his toils throughout the days of his life, which God has given him under the sun. Eating and drinking. It's not only necessary for life, but they're some of the most simplest and even enjoyable things that we get to do on this earth. Recently, Pastor Seymour and I had a conversation about island food and some of our favorite dishes that we've had from these Caribbean dishes. And also, hunger and thirst here are two things that are satisfiable. If you remember chapter 1, verse 8, Solomon says that the eye is not satisfied with hearing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. But hunger can be satisfied, and thirst can be quenched. This associates labor with the reward, the ability to satisfy oneself with good food. Furthermore, work, while it has its challenges and burdens, it can also be enjoyable. God allows us to experience a sense of accomplishment when we work heartily as unto the Lord. When we work and we do well and we produce a quality result, great customer service, we can feel good about the job and the work that we've done. And as a Christian, job performance should be a very good concern of ours, not just to please ourselves, not just to please our bosses and our clients, but before the Lord, as it pleases him. But also, I would say, for our own selves. We should aim to do well. I mean, who would take pleasure out of doing a bad job in producing poorly. None of us would. And I'm sure even for the youth here, you can say that it feels good to get an A on your test, does it not? Of course. So when you consider these basic, simple pleasures that we get to enjoy in life, it puts things in perspective. We can find a sense of satisfaction in them, but we shouldn't expect to derive satisfaction from them. Let me explain. Derek Kidner, in his commentary on Ecclesiastes, he says this: for in themselves and rightly used, the basic things of life are sweet and good. Food and drink and work are samples of them, and Koheleth will remind us of others. What spoils them is our hunger to get out of them more than they can give, a symptom of longing which differentiates us from the beast, but whose misdirection is the underlying theme of this book. For example, how many of you say that you dine out maybe once a week? Right? Twice a week, once a month, something, right? Either lunch or dinner, Ruth Chris, El Pollo Loco, I don't know. We all have our favorite places that we go, favorite dishes that we try when we're out. But have you ever experienced where you've had food from a place that usually does it well, but this time they just dropped the ball a little bit? Yeah. Not that you get food poisoning or anything. That's a different ball to drop. But what I'm saying is that it just wasn't as good as the first time you've had it, right? You've had that before. So sure, that happens. But at the end of the day, would you be willing to admit that the dissatisfaction that we have in the food that we get is based on expectations we had out of it before we got it? Would you agree with that? But if you remember, dear Christian, as is your habit every time you're about to sit down and eat a meal, before you took a bite out of that food, you bowed your head and you thanked God for the food, did you not? Just his providence in allowing you to purchase it and eat it is worthy of thanksgiving, for one, because you know that you don't deserve it, right? And for two, that there's others who don't get to enjoy the experience of having their hunger and their thirst satisfied, and you're about to do that right now. And that understanding is where God has led Solomon to at the end of his pleasure seeking. He says the satisfaction that we get from food and drink and vocation is actually from the hand of God. Furthermore, he says in the next verse, in verse 25, for who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? Not only the opportunity to eat comes from him, but the ability to enjoy and to have enjoyment out of it is from him. Food is not just fuel for more work, but by the grace of God, it's enjoyable, is it not? Especially when it's made from the hands of our loving wives and mothers, right, men? All right, I'll take an amen on that if you have one of those. Notice he says enjoyment. There it is. That's what Solomon was looking for the whole time. Look at chapter 2, verse 1. He says, I said to myself, come now and I will test you with pleasure, so enjoy yourself. But Solomon's issue was that he wanted to work and get it out of his own efforts instead of receiving it from the gracious hand of God. And seeking pleasure became his main focus instead of appreciating his relationship with God, who provides sustenance as well as the enjoyment that it yields. That never goes well when we do that, does it? Even in the case of enjoyment, God's grace does what man's works can't. Herbert Leupold again states, the thought of this passage is, true enjoyment is possible, but it does not lie within man's power to bestow it on himself. Man is not the fountain of good. Such good is for the present defined as eating and drinking and getting satisfaction, but even that does not lie within man's power to bestow it upon himself. Eating and drinking are gifts from God and can't be enjoyed or had without his providence. And so great is the grace of God that he gives it to us even when we're ungrateful or when we complain about something or leave a negative Yelp review just because something doesn't meet a standard that we've set on it. If If you remember Lamentations chapter 3, verse 39, it says, why should any living mortal or any man offer complaint in view of his sins? You ever consider a salad, variety of fruits and vegetables? And you realize that in the providence of God, every fruit and vegetable in that salad was individually grown by God, knowing that you would eat it. That's how real his providence is. And when I say providence, I'm not just talking about the surprising coincidences that happen to us, that we actually get to see in life and take notice of. I'm talking about the everyday, moment by moment grace that we receive every single minute of our lives. Because we live our lives coram Deo, before the face of God, but all that we have is from the hand of God. Remember that on your next meal. Knowing these things puts it all into proper perspective, and it makes the experience even better. Especially for those that understand and appreciate God's gift. His grace is abundant. Last point, last verse here. This is the last point. Wealth of the sinner is vanity. In verse 26, he says, for to a person who is good in his sight, he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. While to the sinner is given the task of gathering and collecting so that he may give to one who is good in God's sight. This too is vanity. And there's two people here, the good in his sight and the sinner. Now right here we should understand that the good in his sight must be ones who live right in the fear of God and does righteously, while the other is characterized by his rebellion, his disobedient acts before God. He's labeled a sinner. He lives in a habitually sinful lifestyle. And then we have two allotments here. Charles Bridges refers to this as divine dispensation. The one who does good in God's sight gets wisdom, knowledge, and joy or gladness. But the sinner, he gets the task of gathering and collecting. Gathering, collecting are words that have to do with acquisition. So this is him working for it, buying it, stocking it up, hoarding it. And he thinks that he's doing it for himself. But also notice that the sinner gets no joy out of what he does. No real enjoyment out of it. No real lasting satisfaction out of this work. And while he's doing all this gathering and collecting for the purpose of his own benefit, at least to him, he's ultimately doing it, God says, so that he may give it to one who is good in God's sight. It's a very interesting concept. This is an example of God's righteous judgment, rarely ever seen on a human level. We see that sinners and worldly men are 100% focused on storing up treasures on this earth because this is the only life for them that there is. According to John MacArthur, he says that this is their best life because their next life is in hell. But they store what they store, and God transfers it to the one who pleases him. And this may be a novel concept to you, but this isn't the only passage in Scripture that says this. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 22 says, a good man leaves his inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. And then in Proverbs chapter 28, verse 8, it says, he who increases his wealth by interest and usury gathers it for him who is gracious to the poor. So while the sinner gathers and collects intending to grasp satisfaction from it, it eludes him and it slips right through his fingers, just like smoke, which is why he says, this too is vanity and striving after wind. So in conclusion, what do we learn from this? What has Solomon, the preacher, the Koheleth, taught you today? That real futility in life is associated with seeking satisfaction and fulfillment in and through the things of this world, because it is incapable of doing something that only God can do. And instead we should look to him for everything, for life, for sustenance, because of that he provides food and drink and even work to produce those things. We look to him for enjoyment for what he provides, for it's unfulfilled without his grace. We look to him for salvation from his own wrath for the sins that we've committed against him. For he provided his son to pay the eternal penalty in our place and provided us with the righteousness that we need to stand before him in a right relationship, and as well as provides his own Holy Spirit for us to live and walk before him in that righteousness. We need to look to him for endurance over the temptations of sin as he provides the way of escape according to 1 Corinthians 10:13. And we look to him for wisdom. For James chapter 1 verse 5 says that he provides it liberally and without reproach. All that we need is from the hand of God. 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 3 says that his power has granted to us everything pertaining to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who has called us by his own glory and excellence. So what is our job? Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, 31 through 34, not to be worried or concerned about the basic necessities of life, like eating and drinking. No, because he says, for your heavenly Father knows that you need these things. But this is what we must do. He says, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. It's always a great reminder for me